When the guns finally fell silent in November of 1918, the world did not celebrate immediately. First, it listened. For more than 4 years, sound had ruled everything. The thunder of artillery, the sharp crack of rifles, the endless noise that told millions of people that death was always nearby. Then, suddenly, there was nothing. No explosions in the distance, no shaking ground, no warning whistles, just silence. For soldiers standing at the front, that silence felt unnatural. Some climbed out of trenches slowly, unsure if the war had truly ended. Others remained where they were, waiting for orders that never came. Many had lived so long inside fear that peace felt unreal. Some soldiers laughed without knowing why. Some cried openly. Some stared at the sky for long moments, as if seeing it for the first time. And some felt nothing at all. The war had taken even that from them. In towns and cities across Europe, church bells rang. Not carefully, not quietly. They rang wildly. Crowds filled streets and public squares. Strangers embraced one another. People celebrated simply being alive. For a moment, joy returned. But beneath the celebration was disbelief. Could it really be over after all the loss, after all the suffering? The physical damage was impossible to ignore. Entire towns had vanished. Villages that once held generations of families existed only in memory. Fields were cratered and poisoned. Railways lay twisted like broken bones. The landscape itself carried scars. Millions were dead. Millions more were wounded. Almost every family was grieving someone, a son, a brother, a father, a friend, yet hope survived. People needed it. They believed the suffering must have meaning. They believed the world had learned something, that such destruction could never be allowed again. Newspapers spoke of a new era. Speeches promised a future built on cooperation. Leaders said the war had changed humanity forever, that progress would now be guided by wisdom. As soldiers returned home, reality followed closely behind. Men arrived in familiar towns that no longer felt familiar. Some were missing arms or legs. Some carried scars no one could see. Many struggled to sleep. Loud sounds triggered panic. Quiet moments felt threatening. Families tried to help, but they did not understand. How could they? They had not lived underground. They had not waited for shells to fall. They had not watched friends disappear in seconds. Veterans felt disconnected from their families, from their communities, from the world they had left behind. They were welcomed home as heroes, but quickly forgotten. Societies were celebrating peace while millions were silently breaking. Governments wanted closure. They wanted to move forward. They wanted to believe the worst was behind them. So attention shifted away from the trenches and toward the future. That future, leaders believed, would be decided in Paris. Representatives from the victorious nations gathered to shape what came next. They arrived confident. Some came seeking security. Some came seeking compensation. Some came seeking punishment. The conference halls were elegant, well-lit, far removed from ruined cities and mass graves. The war felt distant here. Maps were spread across long tables. Borders were discussed calmly. Entire nations were debated like ideas. Lines were drawn that would decide lives for generations. The defeated were not present, not as equals. They would be summoned later, to listen, to accept, to sign. The mood was confident, almost optimistic. This, many believed, was history being repaired. One idea guided nearly every decision, that the war had been caused by aggression, and aggression must be punished. Very few asked a harder question. How do you punish a nation without punishing millions of ordinary people? That question would be ignored outside the conference halls. Life was already difficult. Food shortages lingered. Jobs were scarce. Homes were destroyed. People wanted stability more than speeches. Veterans struggled to find work. Their skills belonged to war, not peace. Their trauma made them restless. Their silence made others uncomfortable. Families who had survived the war now struggled to survive peace. The gap between leaders and ordinary people widened. One spoke of treaties and borders, the other spoke of hunger and loss. Still, hope remained fragile, but present. People believed peace would improve with time, that wounds would heal, that life would return to normal. But normal no longer existed. The world of 1914 was gone, and the new world was uncertain. As the conference continued, decisions piled upon decisions. Each one seemed reasonable in isolation. Each one carried consequences that were barely considered. Peace was being designed carefully, but without listening. The war had ended suddenly, but the damage it left behind was slow, deep, and unresolved. This was the silence after war. Not calm, not healing, but waiting for consequences. While cities across Europe were still clearing rubble, while families searched for missing sons, and while veterans struggled to sleep through the night, the future of the world was being discussed. Some you were very different in Paris. The people who gathered there did not arrive as survivors. They arrived as representatives, as leaders, as victors. They came dressed formally, carrying documents instead of memories, maps instead of grief. The war felt distant inside those halls. There was no mud on the floors, no smell of smoke in the air, no reminders of the trenches. Only quiet conversations about borders, responsibility, and power. Each nation arrived with its own priorities. Some wanted security above all else. They feared another war and believed only strict control could prevent it. Others wanted compensation. They had lost cities, industries, and entire generations. They believed they were owed something in return. And some wanted punishment, not quietly, not subtly. They believed the suffering demanded consequences, that the defeated must feel the cost of what had happened. These goals did not always agree, but they shared one assumption, that peace could be designed by those who had won the war. Maps were spread across long tables. Borders were discussed calmly. Lines were drawn and redrawn. A pen moved, and with it, the future of millions changed. Entire regions were divided without consulting the people that lived there. Communities were separated. Others were forced together despite long histories of tension. The language used was careful, measured, but behind the words were decisions that would shape lives for generations. The defeated nations were not invited to participate as equals. They were discussed, evaluated, judged. But not heard. Germany in particular became the focus, not just as a defeated nation, but as the symbol of the war itself. The idea took hold quickly that this war had one clear cause, and that cause must be punished. Responsibility was assigned broadly. Blame was simplified. Complexity was ignored. Germany was presented not as a country of people, but as a problem to be solved. Its army would be reduced. Its territory would be taken. Its economy would be tightly controlled. And its future would be shaped by others. The goal, leaders said, was to prevent another war. But prevention was defined as restriction, as limitation, as humiliation. Very few paused to ask a deeper question. What does it mean to force an entire population to live with loss, shame, and anger? What happens when people feel punished, but not understood? Those questions did not fit easily into discussions of treaties. So they were set aside. Outside the conference halls, life remained difficult. Food was still scarce. Jobs were still few. Homes were still damaged. People wanted stability. They wanted work. They wanted reassurance that the future would be better than the past. Inside the halls, leaders spoke of long-term peace. But outside, people lived day to day. The gap between decision-makers and ordinary people widened. One spoke of borders and agreements. The other spoke of hunger and loss. Still, optimism lingered. Many believed strict terms were necessary, that discomfort now would prevent disaster later. Idea of punishment felt logical. Order would be restored, balance would return, but peace built on pressure is fragile. And fragility was already visible. As discussions continued, the foundations of the new world were being laid, carefully, confidently, and without listening to the people who would live inside it. This was how peace began, not with healing, but with decisions. Decisions made far from ruins. When the decisions were finally written down, they did not sound cruel. They sounded official, measured, final. They were presented as terms, agreements, conditions for peace. To the people who wrote them, they felt necessary. Order had to be restored. Security had to be guaranteed. Another war had to be prevented. But to the people who would live under them, they felt very different. Germany was summoned to receive the terms, not to negotiate, not to explain, but to accept. The atmosphere was cold, formal. There was no celebration, no sense of closure, only pressure. The message was clear: sign or face consequences far worse. Germany's military was reduced dramatically, not just weakened, stripped. Large portions of territory were taken away. Land that had been home to generations was suddenly no longer theirs. Economic obligations were imposed, heavy ones, payments that would stretch far into the future, payments that assumed stability in a world that had none. Responsibility for the war was declared openly, placed squarely on Germany, written into the agreement itself. This mattered more than borders, more than money, because it shaped identity. An entire population was told that they were to blame, not just leaders, not just generals, but the nation. To those who imposed the terms, this felt like justice. To those receiving them, it felt like humiliation. And humiliation does not disappear quietly across Germany. Reactions were immediate: confusion, anger, disbelief. People struggled to understand how responsibility could be assigned so simply, how suffering could be measured so coldly. Many Germans had lost sense. Brothers, fathers, friends. They did not feel like aggressors. They felt like survivors. The terms did not reflect their experience. They erased it. Elsewhere in Europe, new nations were emerging. Some celebrated independence. Others faced uncertainty from the beginning. Borders drawn on paper did not erase old rivalries. They often sharpened them. Minorities found themselves trapped inside new states where they did not belong. Old tensions were frozen, not resolved. Peace had been declared, but stability had not been built. The agreements assumed cooperation, but cooperation requires trust, and trust was already broken. The economic strain spread quickly. Markets faltered, currencies weakened, jobs disappeared. Ordinary people felt the impact first. They always do, as daily life grew harder. The terms of peace became impossible to ignore. They were no longer words on paper. They were lived realities. Resentment grew slowly, quietly, not in speeches at first, but in homes, in workplaces, in conversations whispered rather than spoken aloud. People did not immediately reject peace. They questioned it. Why does peace feel like punishment? Why does survival feel harder now than during the war? Leaders struggled to respond. They had signed agreements. They had promised stability, but they had little control over outcomes. The peace treaties ended the fighting, but they did not end fear. They did not end hunger. They did not end anger. Instead, they reshaped it. What had once been directed outward toward enemies, now turned inward, toward governments, toward institutions, toward the idea of peace itself. The belief that cooperation could protect people began to weaken. The belief that compromise was strength began to fade. This did not happen overnight. There were no dramatic announcements, no sudden collapse, just a slow erosion. The peace was holding, but barely, and beneath the surface, new forces were forming, quietly, patiently. The agreements that were meant to secure the future had instead created uncertainty. Peace had been signed, but peace had not been felt, and this gap between words and reality would soon matter more than anyone expected. Peace had been signed, the fighting had stopped, but for millions of people, life did not become easier. It became harder. In many parts of Europe, the end of the war did not bring relief. It brought uncertainty. Factories that had worked endlessly during the war slowed down or closed. Soldiers returned home looking for work that no longer existed. Cities that had survived the fighting now struggled to survive peace. Money lost value. Savings disappeared. Families who had endured years of sacrifice suddenly found themselves with nothing. The war had taken sons. The peace took livelihoods. For veterans, returning home was not a return at all. The world they had left behind no longer matched the one they found. Some were welcomed with praise, but celebration faded quickly. Reality followed. Many veterans carried wounds that were easy to see, missing limbs, damaged bodies. Others carried wounds no one could see, restless nights, sudden fear, memories that refused to stay buried. They struggled to fit back into daily life. Factories did not need soldiers. Farms did not know how to handle trauma. Families did not know how to help. Some veterans felt invisible. They had survived something extraordinary, only to feel ordinary and unwanted. Across Europe, similar patterns emerged. Entire societies were exhausted. People were tired of sacrifice, tired of waiting, tired of promises. The peace demanded patience. But patience was already gone. Food shortages continued in some places. Hunger returned. Children grew thin. Parents worried constantly. Governments asked people to endure just a little longer, to trust the system, to believe recovery was coming. But belief is fragile, and it had already been damaged by war. Democratic governments struggled the most. They debated. They compromised. They moved slowly, but slow felt dangerous, and compromise felt weak. People wanted certainty. They wanted order. They wanted someone who sounded confident. As daily life became more difficult, anger began to shift. It was no longer directed only at former enemies. It turned inward. People blamed governments. They blamed institutions. They blamed the peace itself, the idea that cooperation could protect. People began to weaken. The idea that compromise was strength began to fade. In public spaces, conversations changed. Hopeful talk disappeared. Cynicism replaced it. People asked hard questions. Why did we suffer if life is worse now? Why did we win if it feels like we lost? The peace had promised stability, but instability defined everyday life. In many countries, political extremes began to gain attention, not because people suddenly loved radical ideas, but because those ideas sounded certain. They promised simple answers. They promised strength. They promised to restore dignity. For people who felt humiliated, ignored, or abandoned, those promises were powerful. Trauma shaped politics in quiet ways. Fear influenced decisions. Anger shaped identity. The generation that had survived the war did not feel triumphant. They felt betrayed. They had been told the war would change the world, but the world felt just as unfair. Only poor. Only harsher. Across Europe, trust in institutions eroded. Trust in leaders weakened. Trust in the idea of shared sacrifice disappeared. People withdrew into smaller identities. Nation, community, group. Cooperation felt risky. Isolation felt safer. The peace had ended violence, but it had not ended. Fear It had not ended resentment. It had not ended the desire for control. Instead, it had shifted where those emotions live, in homes, in workplaces, in conversations whispered rather than shouted. The burden of peace was heavy, heavier for many than the burden of war. Because war had demanded endurance, peace demanded faith, and faith was gone. This was the world that emerged after World War I, not calm, not healed, but strained. A world holding together out of habit rather than belief. The treaties had drawn borders, but they had not drawn trust. The war had proven how destructive humanity could be. The peace proved how little had been learned. And as the years passed, the cracks widened. People searched for meaning, for direction, for something solid to hold onto. What they would find next would reshape the world again. Because peace, when it fails to heal, does not remain neutral. It becomes a weight, a burden carried by everyone. And under that burden, new dangers were quietly taking shape. The end of the war was supposed to close a chapter. Instead, it opened another one. Not loudly, not suddenly, but quietly. In the years following the peace, the world did not collapse. It drifted slowly, almost unnoticed. There were no marching armies at first, no decorations, no explosions. Just a growing sense that something was wrong. Across Europe, people tried to rebuild their lives. Cities were repaired, factories reopened, children returned to school. On the surface, life continued, but beneath its surface, the foundations were unstable. The war had ended violence, but it had not ended fear. Many people felt humiliated, others felt forgotten, some felt betrayed, and many felt all three at once in countries that had lost the war. Anger hardened, not wild anger, not chaos, but something colder, something patient. People did not forget the terms of peace. They lived with them every day, in reduced wages, in lost territory, in the feeling of being judged by the world. They were told this suffering was necessary, that it would protect the future, that it was the price of peace. But suffering without purpose does not create loyalty. It creates resentment. In countries that had won the war, fear replaced relief. Leaders worried constantly about instability. They worried about borders, about uprisings, about losing what they had gained. Trust between nations remained thin. Cooperation felt fragile. Every decision was cautious. Every disagreement felt dangerous. The world was officially at peace, but no one felt safe. Trauma shaped everything. Veterans carried it home. Families lived with it. Children grew up surrounded by stories of loss. An entire generation learned that the world could collapse without warning, that rules could vanish, that survival was never guaranteed. This lesson stayed with them. In this environment, strong voices began to stand out. Not immediately, not everywhere, but slowly. These voices spoke with certainty. They offered simple explanations, clear enemies, clear solutions. They spoke of pride, of strength, of restoring what had been taken. For people who felt humiliated, those words mattered. For people who felt ignored, those voices felt seen. Democratic systems struggled to respond. They moved slowly. They debated. They hesitated. But hesitation felt dangerous, and debate felt weak. People who had lived through war did not want complexity. They wanted clarity. They wanted control. Economic problems made everything worse. Jobs disappeared. Inflation returned. Savings vanished. Fear became part of daily life. Not fear of bombs, but fear of the future. In this fear, extremes began to feel reasonable, not because people loved violence, but because they wanted certainty. The peace treaties had tried to freeze history, to lock the world into place. But history does not freeze. It adapts, it reacts. Borders drawn without consent became sources of tension. Minorities found themselves trapped inside new states. Old rivalries resurfaced. New grievances formed. The war had ended empires, but it had not ended imperial thinking. Promises made during the war were forgotten. Communities that had been encouraged to hope were left waiting. Disappointment turned into anger. Anger turned into identity. Across the world, nations withdrew inward. They focused on themselves. They stopped trusting international promises. Cooperation weakened. Isolation grew. The belief that shared rules could prevent conflict began to fade. People remembered how quickly civilization had collapsed once before, and they wondered if it could happen again. Slowly, the idea of another war stopped feeling impossible. It began to feel likely, not because people wanted it, but because no one believed it could be avoided. This is how the next war was born. Not from one moment, not from one decision, but from years of unresolved anger, from humiliation left untreated, from fear allowed to grow. The seeds were planted in conference rooms, watered by hardship, fed by silence. By the time the world realized what was happening, those seeds had already taken root. The peace had failed, not because it ended fighting, but because it failed to heal. World War I did not lead directly to another war. It created the conditions for one, and those conditions were now firmly in place. The world stood at a crossroads, but it did not recognize it. What came next would not feel sudden. It would feel familiar, because the warning signs had already been seen once and ignored. In the next episode, we follow a world growing increasingly unstable. A world where fear replaces trust, where extremes gain ground, and where history begins to repeat itself.